His bright red MAGA hat sparked whispers and judgment as he walked into the hospital seeking care. The doctor refused to treat him, masking disdain with a thin veneer of professionalism. What no one realized was that this patient owned the entire hospital. What happened next shocked everyone. The lobby of Harris Memorial Hospital gleamed under the midday sun, its polished floors reflecting the hustle of nurses in scrubs and patients in waiting chairs. The air carried the faint scent of antiseptic, blending with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional rustle of clipboards. Jonathan Harris, a 60-year-old businessman with neatly combed silver hair and piercing blue eyes, entered with a steady, confident stride. His tailored navy blazer, dark jeans, and polished brown shoes exuded quiet sophistication. But it was his bright red MAGA hat, bold white letters gleaming under the fluorescent lights, that drew stares. Conversations hushed as heads turned, and a few nurses exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Jonathan approached the reception desk, where a young nurse in her early 20s, with blonde hair tied in a ponytail and a sky blue uniform, greeted him hesitantly. Her eyes flicked to his hat, then back to her computer screen. "Good afternoon," Jonathan said, his voice calm and measured as he slid his medical file onto the counter. "I have an appointment with Dr. Sullivan." The nurse hesitated, then nodded, her professionalism quickly overriding her surprise. "Yes, sir. Please have a seat. He'll be with you shortly." At that moment, Dr. Mark Sullivan appeared in the hallway. At 40 years old, he had dark, neatly styled curly hair, sharp green eyes, and a crisp white lab coat draped over a gray button-down shirt and dark slacks. His polished loafers clicked against the tiles as he walked, exuding an air of authority. Spotting Jonathan, Dr. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips curved into a thin, disapproving smile. He paused deliberately, his voice rising just enough to be heard by the staff and patients nearby. "Mr. Harris, is it?" he said, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "Welcome. I trust your political enthusiasm won't interfere with your healthcare decisions today." A ripple of subdued laughter echoed from the nurse's station. A man in the waiting area glanced over his newspaper, while another patient tilted her head in quiet disapproval of the doctor's tone. Jonathan met Dr. Sullivan's gaze with an unwavering calm, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Dr. Sullivan," he replied, his voice steady and smooth, "I trust you'll prioritize medicine over personal opinions. Shall we?" The quiet murmur of the room was now charged with a subtle tension as Jonathan followed the doctor into the examination room. Behind them, the staff exchanged furtive glances, some curious, others amused. As the door clicked shut, the stage was set for an unexpected showdown. The fluorescent lights in the sterile examination room cast a harsh clinical glow on the white walls and metallic instruments, neatly arranged on the counter. The air was thick with antiseptic, and the steady hum of the overhead vent provided a faint backdrop to the brewing tension. Dr. Sullivan stood confidently by the desk, his lab coat unbuttoned to reveal his gray shirt and patterned tie. He leaned against the edge of the desk, one hand casually flipping through Jonathan's medical file, while the other rested on his hip. His green eyes flicked up briefly, catching sight of Jonathan's bright red MAGA hat, the bold white letters practically daring him to comment. Jonathan Harris sat calmly on the padded examination chair, his polished brown shoes planted firmly on the floor. His posture was relaxed but composed, his navy blazer unbuttoned to reveal a crisp white shirt. The hat atop his silver hair remained steadfast, a subtle symbol of defiance. "You know," Sullivan began, his tone laced with mockery, "I've treated all kinds of patients in my career, but it's not every day you see someone walk in wearing their politics like a badge, especially in a place that values science." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Sullivan's with quiet amusement. "I'd like to think a doctor's duty to their patients transcends personal opinions," he replied smoothly, adjusting the brim of his hat just enough to draw attention to it. Sullivan's lips curved into a smirk as he leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the desk. "Oh, I agree, but let's be honest. Some choices speak louder than words. He flipped through the file with exaggerated nonchalance. Each page turned punctuated by a deliberate pause. And some, he added with a pointed glance at the hat, are just plain questionable. Jonathan's faint smile didn't waver. Questionable choices, he said, his tone calm but edged with subtle irony, like letting personal judgments interfere with professional obligations. The jab landed, and Sullivan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly regained his composure. "Touché," he said, though his voice carried an unmistakable edge. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the exchange. The nurse from earlier, her blonde ponytail now slightly disheveled, stepped in cautiously. Her blue scrubs rustled as she hesitated in the doorway, her expression a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "Dr. Sullivan," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "Is everything okay in here?" Sullivan straightened, brushing off her question with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just a little patient education," he said, the smirk creeping back onto his face. "Nothing to worry about." The nurse glanced at Jonathan, her eyes flickering with a hint of sympathy. Jonathan met her gaze with a calm smile, his demeanor unshaken despite the undercurrent of tension. "Well, if you need anything," she said carefully, backing out of the room, "just let me know." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two men alone once more. Sullivan returned his attention to Jonathan, his confidence emboldened by the interruption. "So," he said, leaning back against the desk, "shall we continue? I wouldn't want you to feel unwelcome. After all, everyone's entitled to their opinions." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his tone steady but deliberate. "And everyone's entitled to respect, Doctor, even if it makes some people uncomfortable." The air in the room grew heavier, the tension thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Sullivan's grin faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly masked it with another flip of the file. The chapter ended with Jonathan sitting tall and composed, the faint smirk on his lips an unspoken challenge. Sullivan, despite his bravado, seemed less sure of his footing, the balance of power beginning to shift in ways neither man fully anticipated. The door clicked shut behind the nurse, leaving Jonathan and Dr. Sullivan alone in the now tense examination room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, accentuating Sullivan's smirk as he crossed his arms. His confidence, fueled by his perception of control, filled the room like a heavy fog. "I'm not sure this is the right fit," Sullivan declared, snapping Jonathan's file shut with a dramatic flourish. "Perhaps you'd be better off with a doctor who's less inclined towards science and evidence." Jonathan rose from his chair, his movement deliberate and calm, but his presence suddenly filled the room. At 6'2", his towering figure and commanding demeanor cast a long shadow over the shorter Sullivan. Jonathan adjusted the brim of his bright red MAGA hat, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the doctor with quiet intensity. "Dr. Sullivan," Jonathan said evenly, his voice low and resonant, "I suggest you check your assumptions before you proceed further." Sullivan scoffed, his bravado faltering slightly but still clinging to his earlier smugness. "And what assumptions would those be?" he asked with a mocking chuckle. Before Jonathan could respond, the sharp click of heels echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each step. The door swung open to reveal Megan Carter, the hospital's administrator. At 45, her sharp features, dark brown hair swept into a bun, and perfectly tailored black suit projected an air of authority that instantly shifted the energy in the room. "Mr. Harris?" Megan greeted warmly, her tone a stark contrast to Sullivan's dismissive attitude. Her eyes sparkled with respect as she approached Jonathan, extending a hand. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Is everything all right?" Sullivan's smirk evaporated as his head snapped between Jonathan and Megan. Confusion clouded his sharp green eyes. "You know him?" he stammered, his earlier confidence draining like air from a punctured tire. Megan turned to Sullivan, her expression cooling into a hard glare that could have frozen water. "Dr. Sullivan," she said, her voice icy and deliberate, "Mr. Harris is not just a patient. He's the owner of this hospital." The silence that followed was deafening. Sullivan's jaw slackened, and his complexion turned pale. His fingers twitched as if trying to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. Jonathan remained calm, his faint smile returning as he adjusted his blazer. "Respect, Doctor," he said, his tone smooth but firm. "It's the cornerstone of good health care, wouldn't you agree?" Sullivan stammered, his words tangled in panic. I didn't realize. I didn't know." Megan didn't give him the chance to recover. "Your behavior is not only unprofessional, Dr. Sullivan, but also unacceptable," she said, her voice cutting like a scalpel. "We'll discuss this further in my office." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression one of mild amusement. "I believe the phrase is, 'First do no harm,'" he said wryly, his words landing like a hammer on Sullivan's crumbling facade. The chapter ended with Jonathan calmly adjusting his hat and Megan escorting Sullivan out of the room. The door swung shut with finality, leaving Jonathan to sit back down in the examination chair, a quiet but undeniable force to be reckoned with. The hallway buzzed with quiet whispers, the incident spreading through the hospital like wildfire. Nurses exchanged wide-eyed glances, orderlies huddled near the coffee machines, and patients leaned closer to overhear the murmurs. A few staff members discreetly pulled out their phones, pretending to check emails while angling their cameras toward the tension-filled room. Megan Carter stepped forward, her heels clicking with sharp authority against the polished floor. Her expression was a blend of professionalism and controlled irritation as she addressed Dr. Sullivan. "Dr. Sullivan," she said sharply, her tone firm but devoid of theatrics, "I expect to see you in my office immediately after this." Sullivan, visibly shaken, nodded quickly, his earlier arrogance now replaced by palpable regret. His green eyes darted toward Jonathan, who stood as calm and composed as ever, the bright red MAGA hat perched confidently on his head. The contrast between Sullivan's shrinking posture and Jonathan's quiet poise was impossible to ignore. Jonathan's piercing blue eyes softened slightly as he turned to Megan. "Megan," he said, his voice measured and kind, "let's not make this more uncomfortable than it already is. Mistakes are lessons in disguise, if we're willing to learn from them." The subtle weight of his words hung in the air, leaving Sullivan scrambling to find his voice. "Mr. Harris," Sullivan stammered, his tone laced with genuine remorse. "I deeply apologize for my behavior. It was unprofessional and inexcusable. He paused, taking a steadying breath. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment." Jonathan studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smile, he extended his hand. "Apology accepted, Doctor," he said, his handshake firm but not overpowering. "Let's focus on the work that truly matters. Caring for people." Sullivan's shoulders relaxed slightly, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," he said earnestly. "I won't take this opportunity for granted." Meanwhile, staff members lining the hallway began to clap softly, a ripple of approval that grew louder as it spread. Patients joined in, a few even giving Jonathan nods of appreciation. The applause wasn't just for the resolution. It was for the grace with which Jonathan had handled the entire situation. Later that afternoon, Jonathan called for a brief meeting with the hospital staff in the main lobby. Standing before the group, he removed his MAGA hat and placed it on the podium, the bold letters catching the light. His silver hair gleamed under the warm overhead lights as he addressed the gathered employees. "Respect," Jonathan began, his deep voice resonating through the room, "isn't optional. It's the foundation of this hospital. It's what makes us strong, united, and capable of achieving the extraordinary. No matter our differences, we owe it to one another and to our patients to act with integrity." The crowd erupted into applause, many staff members standing a little taller, their admiration for Jonathan evident. Even Sullivan, standing quietly at the back of the room, clapped with earnest appreciation. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan tipped his hat slightly before placing it back on his head. His faint smile carried a sense of quiet triumph as he left the podium, weaving through the crowd with a nod here and a handshake there. His presence left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. Outside the hospital, The golden sunlight bathed the building's facade as a young journalist stood nearby, camera in hand. She snapped a photo of Jonathan as he exited the building, his red MAGA hat standing out like a beacon of resilience and calm amidst the chaos of the day. The next morning, newspapers and social media platforms buzzed with the story. A viral headline read, "When respect heals, the hospital owner who taught a doctor a lesson." The story became a testament not just to one man's grace, but to the power of humility, respect, and second chances.